Hi, it's Simon here from Analog Anorak, and today's video is part 2 of my Early Decca Digital highlights video. Since making the first part, I did manage to dig up a few more interviews with Tony Griffiths, mainly thanks to the online archive World Radio History. I also found some interviews with a UK recording engineer called Tony Faulkner. He covered many of the issues around recording during the early digital era, and his comments are refreshingly outspoken, probably because he worked freelance. My selections come from the era where CD had quickly ascended into the prized priority format, and using that triple D digital chain promised a future freed from tape hiss, ticks, clicks, and all other irritating pollutants. And the whole idea of Decca releasing a pure analog series would have been viewed as a rather strange oxymoron. By this time, the digital teams at the coalface had sufficient experience and feedback that they had managed to work out a few useful hacks that could be used to be able to combat current limitations with the digital systems, especially the problem that some of the detailed, wonderful sounding master recordings that they were hearing, by the time they'd been through the chain and reached the consumer, had a tendency to sound a bit cold, clinical, and for longer pieces, very fatiguing too. These were hacks at the front end, trying to inject a bit more warmth into the system. One surprising turn of events was that vintage valve microphones were quite helpful, as long as they were in perfect working order. In contrast, close miking was definitely out. There was a general tendency to rein in the amount of multi-miking. But sadly, only Teldec took this to its logical conclusion with some great results. Large and airy venues with that tendency to give warmer acoustics were much more in demand in this period. Part 2 starts at Decca's home turf of London, and I've chosen for recording number 7 this one. It's De La Rocha's digital version of Defia's Nights in the Gardens of Spain. It was recorded in London in July 1983. It was part of an extended De La Rocha session, which also produced 2 albums of solo piano works. You'll find it's pretty easy to pick up a copy either on vinyl or on CD because of its commercial and critical success. It's a well-known performance of this piece and retains to this day a degree of reference recording status. I think this is largely because of the performance, but the sonics are reasonably adequate. The performance benefits from the dream team collaboration of De La Rocha and Frubeck de Burgos. La Rocha and the London Philharmonic Orchestra weave together a dreamy nocturne, evoking the perfumes and passions of a sultry Spanish night. For this recording, Decca teamed Michael Haas, a young producer who had joined Decca in 1978, alongside Stanley Goodall, a Decca stalwart who'd had several positions since he'd joined Decca in 1949. This teaming pops up once more in this video. Stanley Goodall bucked a trend that was happening with many of the Decca's old guard around this period. It followed the resignation of Arthur Haddy. Around that time, there were big changes in atmosphere, but also the change to the digital system and the takeover by Polygram was sufficient for several staff to follow Arthur Haddy. Stanley Goodall's quite varied career through Decca does indicate that he thrived on change and new challenges. So for him, I think the arrival of the Decca recording system was seen as a great opportunity to have one last big challenge and adventure before going into retirement himself. Producer Michael Haas had written a little bit about this recording, and I found it in all places, the customer comment section of Amazon. He'd mislaid his original copy, so decided to buy another CD and left a few comments on his thoughts on listening to this recording again 30 years after it was made. And he was really surprised how well it stood up. He wrote the venue of the recording was excellent and provided an acoustical glaze that suited the Spanish impressionism of the music. The venue he was talking about was Walthamstow Assembly Halls and not Kingsway Hall. Tony Faulkner did give a detailed interview with Studio Sound where he commented on the advantages of Walthamstow. He indicated it was really quite easy to get good results due to its warm, clear sound. He said unlike other venues, it was also appreciated by the musicians because they could hear themselves play as well as their colleagues around them. It benefited from the classic shoebox shape, and it also had high ceilings. The orchestra was situated on a suspended wooden floor, which was well damped, so it gave a warm sound without much of a tendency to boom. Before this La Rocha session, there had hardly been any digital recordings held in Walthamstow. A trend for using Kingsway started as far back as the early experimental work by the digital team and continued into the commercial recording period. I've mentioned that the results of the first few recordings were pretty mediocre, but with time, practice and experience, they were making good progress. One favourite of mine is a recording captured by Stanley Goodall in March 1981. It's the Sibelius on Saga. It really stands out, and recordings like this did suggest that with time they would be able to get a digital equivalent to rival the prized analogue Kingsway sound. But, and this is a large but, behind the scenes all was not well at Kingsway. So even though with this recording it's definitely not achieved some of the sonics that were achieved even earlier at Kingsway, the future was actually Walthamstow Assembly Halls. And just 6 months after this recording was made, the Decca Kingsway era was over. I recently visited the site in London where Kingsway stood to take some photos and video to help explain what the problem was and why Decca gave up on Kingsway. If you take the tube to Holborn Station and walk a little way down Kingsway, you can see to the right some remnants of Kingsway Hall are still there. You can still see a little bit of the exterior is still there, particularly the front entrance to Kingsway Hall. You can also see and hear pretty much any time of the day what the problem was that was literally at Kingsway's front door. Decca's association with Kingsway Hall started just after the Blitz, as at that point Kingsway's basement was being used as a public bomb shelter. From the 50s onwards, the amount of traffic going up and down Kingsway steadily increased. While the analogue recordings were taking place, it wasn't so much of an issue, but the heightened sensitivity of the digital recording system and the new format of CD did mean that it was an issue. The immediate problem was in relation to editing. The traffic level volumes were constantly changing due to the presence of traffic lights at a nearby junction. Editing proved to be timely and difficult because these varying amounts of volume meant it was a real challenge to preserve the seamless quick crossfades if the background levels of traffic noise were vastly different. This didn't just impact on cost and time involved. Tony Faulkner discussed similar scenarios that he was involved with that ultimately led to him dropping one church which had superior sonics but problems with background noise. He noticed that this process could have a chilling effect as the session continued, especially when superior takes had to be rejected due to the presence of significant background noise. At Walthamstow Assembly Halls, however, things were just so easy because of its location not being in inner London, and that the town hall complex it was part of was situated far back from any busy traffic routes. In the early 80s, Tony Griffiths was promoted to Arthur Haddey's old role as general manager of Decca. He decided that Kingsway Hall was no longer a practical option for recording. Walthamstow was becoming very popular with all of the London-based digital teams. Decca began negotiations with Walthamstow and managed to get a contract which was suitable for the direction they were heading. It greatly increased the number of fixed bookings each year, and this arrangement continued for about the next 15 years. The contract even had the advantage of a small dedicated back room just for Decca, which they could kit out, which would also save time. After the contract was agreed, by December 1983, Kingsway Hall's fate was sealed. The last Decca session was the Fitzwilliam Quartet, recording one of Beethoven's final quartets to bring down the curtain on the Decca Kingsway era. For digital recordings 8 and 9, we cross over to Berlin. Riccardo Chailly had been under exclusive contract with Decca since 1978. In 1982, he became principal conductor with the Radio Symphony Orchestra in Berlin. Before then, Decca had very little direct involvement with German orchestras and venues. They had, since the 1950s though, an indirect involvement through funding in partnership with Telefunken, the recording organisation Teldec. As part of the arrangements, Teldec was responsible for the German pressings of Decca records. Over time, Teldec also developed a roster of German orchestras and artists, and they often recorded them in Berlin at the Teldec studio complex. It was kind of Berlin's Art Deco answer to Abbey Road Studios. There was one famous exception in the 1970s to Decca's hands-off approach to German orchestras and venues, and it was this legendary all-star recording of Puccini's La Bohème, featuring Pavarotti and Freni, Karajan and the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. It was probably due to Karajan's clout with DG that Decca was granted limited access to Jesus Christus Kirche, which was one of DG's most jealously guarded venues in Berlin. On that occasion, Jimmy Locke had headed a team of experienced Decca recording engineers tasked with mastering the venue's acoustics within the brief window of 4 days. And they smashed it. Jimmy Locke's positive experience recording La Bohème did simplify the process when he was tasked with finding a suitable warm-sounding location for Chailly and the Berlin RSO. Decca's situation had changed massively since the 1970s La Bohème recording. They were now under the Polygram umbrella with DG. This also impacted on the funding situation with Teldec, and Decca had to extract themselves from this arrangement. It was a fairly amicable divorce. Teldec continued to do the German pressings of Decca records. And occasionally Decca did use the Teldec studio complex in Berlin. As I've explained, the situation with digital recording meant that you were better off getting one of these large, warm, airy locations than trying to get a decent sound from a studio location. The new arrangement did mean that Decca was allowed a far more generous nature of access to Jesus Christus Kirche, with an arrangement that involved fairly regular use over a 15-year period. Chailly's first recording session with the Berlin RSO took place in September 1982. The content chosen was well within Chailly's comfort zone, and it was this recording, a compilation of Puccini's early orchestral works. Despite most of these being really quite early compositions, they do contain moments of glorious distinctive Puccini. This recording does occasionally hark back to 1972 with a bit of shared heritage, including a student composition, Capriccio Sinfonico, which was later reworked into the beginning of La Bohème. Jimmy Locke was also at the controls, and after hearing quite a few disappointing examples of his early digital engineered works, it's quite staggering to hear such a beautiful recording associated with Jimmy Locke. The sonics are so much better, with a pleasing punchiness in the dynamics, but also a bass to die for. I think this is a little unknown gem of a recording. It's like a little double espresso shot of concentrated Puccini. After the great results from the Puccini recording session, Jimmy Locke handed over the recording engineering duties to Stanley Goodall, who was also covering the Sophiensaal at that time as well. With the next few recordings, Stanley Goodall did capture some of a flourishing creative partnership developing between Chailly and the Berlin RSO. He was joined again by Michael Haas in June 1984 for a watershed recording of Bruckner's Seventh Symphony. The recording took place straight after a really successful tour where Chailly had noticed the RSO had reached a new level as far as sound and style. The powerful but lyrical performance still retains to this day some reference recording credibility. And it was an impressive statement of intent on Chailly's side to show that there was much more to him than being Decca's current Italian opera guy. The CD and the vinyl versions were released in March 1985, and they illustrate well by this point how low vinyl had sunk, becoming a low priority afterthought. Previously, prestige vinyl releases of Bruckner's Seventh would tend to come out spread over 3 sides, quite often with the 4th side including a shorter Wagner piece. Things had changed, however, and Decca decided to release this just over 2 sides. This was very much a budget solution and involved splitting the adagio, also excessively long sides where the sonics were inevitably going to deteriorate, especially as the endings were very brass heavy. Ted Burkett was Decca's go-to cutting artisan when it came to well-honed skills in riding the cutting lathe controls for excessively long classical music sides. He took on the task of cutting the 37 plus minutes on side 1, and I suspect from listening to the end results, he made an executive decision to preserve the allegro at the expense of the adagio, where the dynamics are significantly reined in at the end. But I've got to say, the allegro is absolutely magnificent. The job of cutting the slightly shorter side 2 was handed to Quentin Williams, but the results are pretty similar, with some fine sounding moments, but certainly some ropey moments in the finale. So sadly, despite some great moments, I can't really recommend this recording. The vinyl version for me might edge it as far as sonic moments, but as far as consistency, I do think you've got to go for the CD format version. I'm also not going to wait for the cavalry to turn up as far as the pure analog releases in the future, because I'd be very surprised if there were safety analog copies made as late as 1984. So congratulations if you've made it this far with my digital top 10. And we finish where we started with Dorati in Detroit. The record I've chosen comes from Dorati's farewell recording session with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. This took place in November 1984 and did result in 2 albums. The most striking recording is this one, a combination of works by Copland and Stravinsky. By 1984, Dorati was no longer conducting live concerts. Plus their previous go-to venue, the United Artists Auditorium, had by then reached a stage of deterioration where it was no longer felt to be safe to be recording in that space. But a very old friend of the DSO came to the rescue again, just like it had done with Mercury and Paret's recording a few decades earlier. I'm talking about Orchestral Hall. Orchestral Hall had a slightly curved variant of the shoebox design. Also built into the design was a natural curve going down to the stage. It was renowned for a very warm sound when live concerts had been held there, such as in the 20s when it was the DSO's original home, and later as the Paradise Theatre, where it had a short renaissance in the late 40s, early 50s, with lots of the legends of jazz playing there. It turned out that its warm qualities just meshed beautifully with the requirements of early digital recording. Plus, I think having to hand Colin Moorfoot as recording engineer didn't do any harm either. The Stravinsky composition, Apollon Mussaget, features some very accomplished string playing with a beautiful sounding tone to it. But for me, I think there's something special and poignant about the performance of the Appalachian Spring Suite. It's a very suitable soundtrack for the very special significance for the Detroit Symphony Orchestra of playing, but also glimpsing a possible future of a revival and return to Orchestral Hall. This was far from guaranteed, requiring a hell of a lot more work, repair, and money. I found that the year 1984 seems naturally to be a good point to finish the period of Decca's very early digital releases. I think that the end results of this recording, made in 1984 and pressed in 1986, are so good that they're not too different from the mature sound and technology involved with Decca in the late 90s, which led to some really significant recordings, such as the Chailly Concertgebouw Mahler cycle and the Blomstead San Francisco Nielsen Symphony cycle. And just from a pragmatic perspective, once you go beyond this point, you're far less likely to come across a disappointing sounding recording as far as the sonics. You might be relieved to know that I'm looking forward to a bit of a digital detox as far as my choice of content. I think as far as my next video, I'll be removing what was dubbed my digital duffel coat and putting on the analog anorak back again. And I'll see you then. Take care. Bye.